Catus Maximus here. This time we're reviewing the Dremel Model 300. I don't have a more modern models than the 300, but they're pretty similar to this one, the newer 3000 and 4000 series. I think they gave just a very small boost to the motor. But this is the first generation of Dremel that was no longer made in the United States. This one was made in Mexico, and actually Mexican tools are pretty nice. They're, as far as, I mean, they really are. I mean, as far as compared to many Chinese tools, I mean, they care more, and it's closer by, so it's easier to maintain quality control from the parent corporation. So as far as that's concerned, the tool itself is just fine. What I really don't like is many of the design changes. Maybe I should talk about one of the ones that I do like, which is that the little hanging clip, which has been a staple on rotary tools for a very long time. As we can see, like this on this Dremel knockoff or these, they've always kind of flopped around, and so they put in a little snap so that it actually holds together. And I'm actually going to do a power demonstration. I'm going to do a demonstration between the first, second, and third generation tools. But since the performance of this is basically the same as the second generation or the third generation tools, this being the fourth generation tool, I figured I would do a power comparison between it and this a knockoff called a Professional Woodworker. This thing has no model or part number. I found this, used at a thrift store. I have no idea where it came from. But as far as knockoffs, it's not a bad unit. It is similar to a Dremel, but except for it's a lot larger. They have a big to hold a bigger, cheaper circuit board for the variable control, and has a dial and a power switch independent of each other, which I do kind of like, versus it just being integrated into one slider. It does have replaceable brushes. It is ball bearing. I have opened it up, surprisingly enough. But it's not a direct knockoff because even though it has a threaded collar, it's actually a smaller diameter and finer thread than what Dremel uses, so it's not compatible with any of the Dremel accessories. Outside that, it has a 3/8 chuck, or excuse me, a 1/8 inch chuck, and does use the standard Dremel wrench and collets. I always thought this knockoff was odd for that because it would take Dremel collets, but it won't take Dremel threaded on accessories. And just for giggles, we have one of the world's cheapest rotary tools. This is the Harbor Freight Super Cheap. I think this thing is like $5 with an 80-piece little tool set. And it's designed to actually plug into your car cigarette lighter. It's only rated at about 10 watts, so 1/6 the power of a early first generation Dremel, which I always thought was kind of amusing because this tool is just a little bit smaller than a first generation Model 260 Dremel, yet this has 6 times the power and obviously is not 6 times the size. And since this has a DC motor in it, you can easily put in a pretty powerful motor, but we can see that it has no ventilation or anything, so we're just trying to make it as cheap as possible and actually claim that it could possibly do real work. In reality, this thing can't do any amount of real work. It is just ridiculously underpowered, very poor quality, really loose motor and really loose spindle in there, aluminum, chuck on it with a brass collet. And the brass collet's actually just fine, but the aluminum threaded just won't last that many cycles. It doesn't even have the capability of taking a wrench. It's just meant to be tightened and loosened by your hand. This is the Harbor Freight 97626, in case anybody was curious about it. But I thought it was a little ridiculous that they came out with this because basically all it's good for is maybe deburring metal lightly, or maybe using a wire brush to lightly clean up some battery terminals, even though it would struggle with even doing that. And I have it plugged into a fairly powerful 250 watt this is a Radio Shack unit. This is actually not a bad unit. It's surprisingly heavy. And this is for testing out car stereos and that kind of stuff. And as we can see, it is a 13.8 volts at 19 amps. So as far as this little tool is concerned, it's the same thing as if it's plugged into a running car. I've also upgraded this unit with additional output capacitance. I put a big additional capacitor in it, and it's pretty ridiculous. Actually, I'll show that right now. If we turn this on, we can see it's turned on. I'll turn it off. That's how much additional capacitance I put in this. It'll run this tool for several seconds just off the capacitors. Anyway, getting back to the Model 300, some of the things I don't like about it is how it's a little bit more bulbous and is not as streamlined as the previous generation that it replaced. It is still 1.15 amps at 35,000 RPM, so the exact same stats. So as far as I can tell, all they did was make the tool a little bit more bulky. It's slightly longer than the previous generation Dremel. The power and variable speed is the same as the Model 395 T6, where it has many little detents as you're adjusting the speed. And so I do appreciate that. And so it works very similar, and it just has a larger lever that's just a little easier to activate. We did mention that it has the hanging clip is now locks in place. And I didn't mind the small button. They put in a larger locking button to make it easier to activate. Unfortunately, it makes it also easier to accidentally hit when you're using the tool. And it is particularly easy. See, their idea here is they've kind of narrowed it there so you would hold it in one position. But many times as you're using a Dremel, you're kind of twisting it around. You're not aware that you're doing that. You're just trying to get at something. You readjust your hand position. It kind of rotates around. And it's just not real obvious that you're getting up close to hitting that button. Or on the previous unit, the button was held in a really tall and well-defined boss. So as you're twisting this around, it's pretty easy to know that, oh, you're bumping in near the button and you want to be careful. I really like how narrow the neck is on the third generation ones. Those are real nice and easy to use to get a nice close grip. This one, it's much thicker even across this cross section, and this way it's really large. And so really they've hurt the ergonomics of the tool. The other issue is now that little ridge where you hold it is quite a distance away from the chuck, the working end. And that's a real disappointment. What was nice about the third generation is they had that flare, so you could just get right down there and really use it like a pencil and get, much finer control. And so they've harmed those ergonomics as well by moving the grip further back from the chuck. So really, they've missed the mark on several points on this tool, and I wouldn't recommend it. I would try to find one of the older ones, because when it comes down to actually using a Dremel to do work, you're going to be more satisfied with how this handles. The performance is the same, but the handling and ergonomics are much different, and they are much worse than the Model 300. And I believe that to be true with all their newer ones. They just really harmed the tool. They had really established what was a great tool and then just basically ruined it. Really unfortunate. As far as this knockoff, like this professional woodworker, this thing has worked out great. It only goes to 30,000 RPM, but it's surprising that some of the knockoff ones, they're a little bit longer, maybe a little bit heavier, but perform excellent. And that's kind of the point I wanted to make, is that a Dremel rotary tool is just a small 100, or in this case, 125 watt motor with a couple ball bearings on it. It's not real hard to knock it off in a fashion that does work relatively reliably. You just have to be careful because they don't always make them compatible with Dremel accessories, such as this one where it's compatible with the collets, but it's not compatible with any of the thread-on stylus, flexible stylus shafts or routing attachments or any of that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm going to move over to a different area here and cut off a standard framing nail with all three of these tools just to, we'll see if this will even cut a framing nail using a standard cutoff blade. But in just 1 second, we'll go ahead and do that. Alright, here we are. We're going to start off with the Model 300 as the baseline. We're going to be using an actual Dremel brand cutoff wheel. They have two, these are the non-heavy duty, the non-fiber reinforced wheels. They do have much heavier duty wheels, such as these right here. However, they are a bit more expensive, so we're going to be using the standard cutoff wheels. They have two grades, a thin standard duty and then a thicker, advertised as a heavier duty cutoff wheel. And this will be the thicker, heavier duty cutoff wheel. And we're just going to be cutting off what is a standard, I believe it's called a 16 penny framing nail, but this is a standard North American framing nail. And of course, always safety glasses, especially with cutting and grinding operations. We're just going to see how long it takes to cut it off at full power. using a moderate amount of force, balancing it with the power of the tool. So, not too bad, and about as expected as a Dremel would be here. So now I'm going to go ahead and just swap this over to that modern woodworker just to compare against the knockoff version. Just a second here. Here we are, the very same wheel, just in the knockoff. And it performs about the same. It did feel like it struggled a little bit more than the actual Dremel did, even though it's rated at the same amount of power. They really do perform just about the same. And just for giggles here, we're going to go ahead and try out that little Harbor Freight unit. Okay, we're actually not going to attempt to do a cutoff with this Harbor Freight tool because the collet is badly misformed, and I measured it, it's 1/8 inch. It's just the drill went sideways when they manufactured it, and the bit just wobbles incredibly badly. So this is going into the trash. Don't ever buy that tool. Instead, comparing it against those standard Dremels, why you might want to use something like a RotoZip. Once again, I mentioned the Solaris just because of how nice it is. All the tools and the collets are all held in the handle. You can pop off the handle just with this easy lever here. Really makes it a pretty nicely designed tool. So this is 3 amps, so nearly triple the power of a Dremel. And so if you really need cut-off power or grinding power, use one of these. And so you saw how well those other two tools work. This is what a 3 amp Solaris would. And technically this is only running at 30,000 RPM, where that 300i was running at 35,000 RPM. Whoop. I was going pretty hard there, and I actually pulled the nail out of my $5 Irwin vise. But as you can see, you can push as hard as you're comfortable. I actually was pushing hard enough to worry about that grinding or that cutoff wheel actually just exploding on me. But if you really need to get it done or have a kind of an aggravating situation, just get something like this. This will do the job, that's for sure. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching. That's going to be the end of this kind of review and comparison of the newer Dremel Model 300. This little guy here, and it works pretty well. And with the accessories, it's probably balanced, realizing it's probably balanced about right unless you're real careful. These real powerful tools do work very well, but you do need to respect them a lot more just because there's a lot more power behind them, and when things bind up, accessories tend to explode, where a Dremel may stall out, the accessory may break, but it just is not as much force and as much violence, so there's something to be said about that. Otherwise, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Catus Maximus out.